Welcome to Oceanside Chat. I'm Helen Wang, the host and editor of the program. As an industry professional, I have experienced several supply chain disruptions caused by catastrophic events, including the series of natural disasters in 2011. At 2:46 p.m. Japan Standard Time on March 11, a magnitude 9.0 undersea megastress earthquake triggered a tsunami, which caused the nuclear accidents in Fukushima, located on the Pacific coast of Tohoku in Japan. As the most powerful earthquake in Japan, the Tohoku earthquake and the tsunami caused almost 16,000 deaths and 300,000 people relocated. Supply chain companies within the region were severely destroyed and impacted. Unfortunately, just a few months later, from July to October of the same year, there was the worst flooding in terms of water and people affected in Thailand, further triggering landfall that impacted 65 out of 67 provinces in Thailand. As a result, multiple tiers of suppliers were affected by both disasters. We applied critical learnings from the Japan earthquake to the Thailand flood. For example, we learned to prioritize humanity, safety, and relationships in crisis management. We learned to improve transparency to assess the true impact from multiple layers of supply chain. We also learned to diversify sources and locations to mitigate similar supply risks. These are great examples of building resilience in supply chain. We cannot predict or stop natural disasters, but our ability to manage disruptions has improved. Now, fast forward to recent years. 2021 was record-breaking for supply chain disruptions. Just to name a few, winter storm slammed Texas food supply chain, Suez Canal blockage of more than 350 ships, then a cyber attack on the Colonial Pipeline. Besides extreme weather and cyber crime, there has been an ongoing China-US trade war since 2018, and the Russian-Ukraine war started last month. Last but not least, pandemic outbreaks and lockdowns around the globe since 2020. As industry professionals, we are familiar with a common clause in supply chain contract called force majeure, which essentially frees both parties from liability and obligation when an extraordinary event or circumstance beyond the reasonable control of the parties, including but not limited to acts of God, earthquakes, hurricanes, flood, war. Previously, the negotiations were hypothetically scenario planning, but now the changing environment and unprecedented disruptions have become a reality and the new norm. For this episode, I'm honored to invite an exceptional guest, one of our board members from the Institute for Supply Chain Excellence and Innovation at UC San Diego, to discuss the hot topic of supply chain resilience beyond COVID-19. Please join me in welcoming John Polowczyk, the Managing Director at Ernst Young and the retired US Navy Rear Admiral. John, thanks for your service and welcome to the Oceanside Chat.
Thanks, Helen. I appreciate you asking me to partake in this podcast and webinar.
So I wanted to ask you a few questions to begin with. Whose life seems most fulfilling to you, and what does their life look like?
That's an interesting question. I gravitate to somebody that I met at a very young age. After graduating high school, going to the Naval Academy prep school, I met a Captain Dick Stratton, who was a Vietnam War POW for almost 7 years. He was a naval aviator, and he was my first commanding officer. And you know, you thought you had a bad day growing up, You want to talk about 7 years of bad days. He had a way of putting things in perspective. And I think when I think about the answer to that question, somebody who has served and done so with a very light heart and have been fulfilled by a lifelong of service and who have endured so others cannot endure or should not endure. I think those are the people that I admire most.
Wow, thanks for sharing. I mean, this is a great way to begin with today's conversation, John. I wanted to get a little fun part of you. What is one thing that people would never guess about you?
So people can talk about, they're a dog lover, they're a cat lover, my wife and I support an animal rescue, a miniature schnauzer rescue. And I have probably in the last 4 or so years have helped rescue and foster somewhere around 28 miniature schnauzers. I think there's been one giant schnauzer in there. And the process of a foster is somebody that can take a dog in for a short period of time. Sometimes that's months, sometimes that's weeks, sometimes it's days. Get them evaluated, medically checked, and understand their fitness, so to speak, for a family environment that may or may not include children, old person, how much exercise, right? And so I bet people wouldn't believe that I've been told to not come home from travel, stop here, pick up a dog, bring it there, and then you can come home. So, yeah, even as a flag officer, we all have a boss.
Yeah, we see the priority for sure. Thanks for sharing that story. Let's see. Have you ever told someone Santa is not real?
Have I ever told someone Santa is not real?
Mm-hmm.
Having 3 kids, at some point they figure it out. And I know I never had to tell anybody Santa's not real. And I'm not quite sure I would tell anybody that Santa's not real.
Great. So, John, all of us tell stories about ourselves, and a story defines us. What story have you written so far?
I think if I was to write a story about myself, it would probably have a title around the accidental admiral. I went to the Naval Academy in the early 80s to really do nothing more than play Division I lacrosse. If I put myself back in walking the halls of my high school and me doing all the things needed to apply to the Naval Academy and then having to go to the Naval Academy prep school, I could not even imagine my career. And I can tell you, my dad was a PhD chemist, academic dean at a university in New York, well-educated person. And when I told him I wanted to go to the Naval Academy, he was sitting on the sofa after dinner reading the New York Times, and an edge of the newspaper came down, and he looked at me and said, "Oh, really?" And the edge of the newspaper came back up because I was mostly interested in wrestling, football, and lacrosse than I was in academics. But I think that story would have started about then. And I don't really remember what I probably said to myself, but his lack of belief probably fueled a little bit of, I'm going to do this. And I think in that journey, you always build that arduous journey. You always build a lot of self-confidence and figure out, well, if I survive that, I can do this. And I think that accidental admiral started with that. Is that a challenge? I'd start that book that way.
I see. Wow. So, but you have 34 years of experience in supply chain and logistics strategy, technology, and finance, a very fulfilling career from the Navy to the White House, then industry. So if we think of life as a book, which one is your favorite chapter?
I think for me, the early years of developing, going through the Naval Academy, graduating, and being a Navy supply chain professional, the early years were filled with lots of learning, lots of adventure. I mean, who gets to say that they? I've been to the North Pole. I've surfaced on with a nuclear-powered submarine in the North Pole and had to manage all of the logistics for a nuclear-powered submarine and all the deployments it's made and the supply chains to support it. And like, who gets to do that as a 20-something-year-old, right? And then being on all the platforms and supporting things and being on a ship in the Gulf of Mexico to have Hurricane Katrina somewhat run over the top of you and manage the Navy's response to Katrina. I just think about things, right? So the early years are very exciting, informative, educating, building things. And then maybe there's that somewhat middle chapter that's the later part of my Navy career where you're senior, you have incredible responsibilities that I'm managing all of the Navy's business systems and having to really understand the technologies and develop a strategy to improve and move forward. I'm a comptroller by background, financial management. I'm an acquisition professional. I've worked on buying pieces of nuclear-powered submarines, etc. I'm a supply chain person. I've done planning. I've written new concepts. And in that later period, I found myself on the Navy staff and then on the joint staff where I was managing all of the joint processes for the global force, whether it be munitions, whether it be all the fuel supply chains and everything else, and doing a lot of deep logistics planning to include thinking about industrial mobilization in time of conflict with great power near peer competitors out in the a little bit out in the right out in the out years 2030 or so, and saying to ourselves, what authorities do we need, and is the Defense Production Act the right authority? And so as I end that chapter ish, I find myself with all of that background of deep logistics planning that both the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Secretary of Defense felt comfortable in sending me over to Health and Human Services to help them do some logistics planning for the pandemic, which turned into, we had nobody managing the national supply chain response. Hey, Admiral, we'd like you to go do that. And find myself talking to then Vice President Pence, who said, yep, I want you on part of the task force, stand up a supply chain task force. And next thing I know, I'm in front of the nation briefing that on a Sunday afternoon.
Mm. Wow. So from March to November 2020, you were the White House supply chain lead on the coronavirus task force.
Yes.
Could you describe your experience in 3 to 5 words from that, special assignment?
Hectic, exhausting, intellectually stimulating, all wrapped into one, which would have been, if I were just to pick one word to describe all of that, unbelievable.
Well, I'm sure our audience wanted to know a lot more about this unbelievable experience you had. So before that, right, just want to set a background here. Over the last 3 decades, minimum geopolitical risk encouraged management to outsource and offshore for profitabilities and shareholder returns. But now that we have a global pandemic, climate challenges, a war, and increasing geopolitical tensions, those efficient supply chains appear to be very vulnerable and fragile in the face of catastrophic disruptions. So John, is there a quick fix to strengthen the supply chain?
So Helen, you just articulated what I stepped into, especially in the medical industrial base. It was very linear. It was outsourced to the max. In fact, we were 85 to 90% reliant on overseas sources. Hospitals, to some degree, really relied on just-in-time delivery. I mean, you pick your major hospital network. Some of them certainly had warehousing capabilities, but many don't, and relied on daily deliveries from the medical supply chain professionals, whether it be a boxed kit of something to manage a surgery, to whatever, when it would show up on a hospital floor, because was your daily demand for those types of material. It was sized and designed for a steady state demand, and there was no thoughts of resiliency. I'm being unfair, I realize, in some sense, but really, I think if you were a medical supply chain professional, you would say, yeah, it's pretty much sized for daily demand, and there wasn't a whole lot of resiliency in the system, and it was efficient and designed to have absolutely the lowest price for that, to help hospitals maintain solvency.